Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Buck Stops Here. I am Catherine Murray. Well, I'm pleased again to be able to bring you a high-level conversation about the state of affairs in Canada, but of course also overseas with Ukraine and Russia, the war, the invasion, and Canada's role and NATO's role right now. I always like to say as well that we are pre-taped, so a lot can happen between now, Friday, and Sunday when this airs. But let me bring in our guest today for this conversation. That is Peter Mackay joining us today. He, of course, was a minister in Harper's government of Foreign Affairs, Justice, and Defense, and is now back in the private sector. Peter, welcome, and thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Catherine. I'm glad you put in that stipulation that things can change rapidly, because they certainly are changing by the hour.
They are. So, you know what? Can you bring us up to date in terms of where you see the state of affairs as it relates to NATO and Ukraine and Russia? What's the latest?
So high-level talks, emergency talks happening in Brussels, including all world leaders, 30 member countries. Most importantly, President Biden there, stepping it up, further sanctions, further discussions about how we get lethal weapons into Ukraine for the purposes, obviously, of repelling this Russian invasion that's now over a month since they crossed the border in many parts of Ukraine, including from the region of Crimea, which in 2014, you'll recall, was annexed by Russia. And interesting to note, Catherine, that much of what is happening, one could say, was predictable. They really began back in the early 2000s, fulminating in Chechnya, a breakaway province, then, of course, in Georgia, then Crimea. And it's been really a continuous effort that's been ramping up on the part of Russia to harass, and I think ultimately, in the mind of Vladimir Putin, to try to pull back into the orbit former Soviet Union countries. Of course, that includes Ukraine, and I think most notably Ukraine. And so they are paying the heaviest price of all of those border countries.
Yeah, it's so interesting. If you, to your point, I mean, awful to say that this was predictable, but we've seen his actions for years now, and here we are watching these cities being bombarded and women and children killed. And what is our role right now, and particularly, are we doing enough?
Well, in short, no, we're not doing enough. I think Canada is probably in the middle of the pack of the countries in terms of what we have supplied already, which does include, in fairness, it includes lethal weapons, missiles, personal protection, so helmets, night vision goggles, rifles, ammunition. But what Ukraine has been asking for, what President Zelensky has repeatedly asked Western countries, NATO countries to provide, is air cover. And so technically what that means is providing fighter aircraft to stop that bombardment that you mentioned, which has been merciless. I mean, they have targeted hospitals, they've targeted public buildings, and most notably, they've targeted civilian areas, particularly in the south, in a city called Mariupol, which has been basically 90% of all of the public and private infrastructure has been flattened. And so this is now into the area of war crimes. And, the word genocide gets thrown around, but war crimes involves the deliberate elimination of human life. And that's what we're seeing happening in Ukraine. These attacks by Russia have had a catastrophic impact and have also, of course, triggered one of the, probably the largest humanitarian crisis and displaced people since Second World War.
Right. And that's what people are saying, that this is, watching another Holocaust take place.
Yeah, it's shocking. I think what we're seeing on the nightly news, if it was in black and white, we would think we were in 1939. And without any let up, clearly Putin now, it's not going as he expected. The Ukrainian people have shown enormous resilience and have the Russians, in fact, on their heels in parts of the country. And so that's why we in the West, Canada included, need to continue to support them any and every way that we can, including getting more weaponry into their country, including, I would suggest, finding a creative way to get fighter aircraft to them so they can protect their skies and protect their civilians.
Absolutely. And I want to understand that a little bit further in terms of why we can't seem to be doing even more, because it's obviously called for. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with Peter Mackay. Peter, I want to understand a little bit more, and I think we all need to, the nuances of a no-fly zone and what Zelensky's really asking for from NATO on this front, and why there's such hesitancy.
So that is a very important question, and one that they've debated endlessly since, pardon me, since this war began. What that essentially means is closing the air over the country, protecting the airspace from foreign intrusion. We saw that happen in Syria. It's happened in other countries when this type of warfare broke out, where another country was relentlessly dropping ordnance bombs on civilians. And it happened most recently in Syria, where the United States basically intervened, cratered a number of airfields inside the country, and prevented other countries, including Russia and Iran, from dropping ordinances inside their country. And so that's what the Ukrainians are looking for. That would have the most profound impact on protecting civilians. The reason that we're seeing NATO and Western countries reluctant to do so, and you'll hear this mantra repeatedly, is that it would provoke a third world war. It would result inevitably in a direct confrontation between Western countries and Russia. The reality is, Catherine, that we are seeing an annihilation of the country of Ukraine, with no indication that Putin will stop. You know, he didn't stop after taking Crimea. I would argue that the confrontation has been ongoing now for years, particularly in countries in the Baltics, with cyber attacks. There have been targeted assassinations outside of Russia by Russian citizens and people deemed to be a threat to Vladimir Putin. And so the provocation argument really doesn't hold a lot of water. But there is obviously nuclear weapons that Putin controls, which are certainly cause for concern. We know that we're dealing with an individual who is quite unhinged, isolated, angry. Things have not gone as he expected. He has taken erratic actions, including the disappearance of some of his own generals. His defense minister hasn't been heard from now in 2 weeks. So there's a lot of obviously confusion and consternation as to what would happen if an airspace closure were to occur and there was to be a direct confrontation between foreign, Western, NATO countries and Russia. I'll add one last point.
Yeah.
There is a way in which Western countries can get the necessary fighter aircraft into Ukraine. That is, disassemble them and bring them across the border, or have Ukrainian pilots go into a neighboring country, Romania, Hungary, Poland, and fly those planes back to Ukraine and then have the ability to take on the Russians. They've taken down a lot of their aircraft with munitions that have been provided by countries like Canada, and they've even sunk a few ships off the coast of the southern part of their country. And so we're seeing, again, the resilience and the effect of arming the Ukrainians to do that heavy lifting, to fight Russia, even though they're an extreme underdog in terms of the size of the forces and the equipment advantage that Russia possesses. But if we get more to Ukraine, they will be able to do more, essentially, to protect all of us, because there is a certain inevitability if Vladimir Putin is able to roll over Ukraine and then go into other countries. That would provoke what's called Article 5, which is something all NATO countries have signed on to, that says if any one country is attacked, all countries then respond. That's what triggered the response to 9/11, where all countries, including Canada, went into Afghanistan.
So there's so much there to unpack. But Peter, what I don't understand is really, I mean, we're supporting them militarily with the arms, but we're not helping them physically do the fight. And
that's right.
So it prolongs what we're seeing. It prolongs the bombing of innocent people. And is this all because they're not a NATO member?
Yes, that is essentially the bottom line, Catherine.
Doesn't make sense. Does that make
It doesn't.
sense?
Ukraine was not given what's called Membership Action Plan in 2008, where they were making a request to join NATO. They were denied by NATO member countries, led predominantly by Germany and France at that time. And had they become members thereafter, this invasion, I believe, would not have occurred. But NATO countries have not gone to the length of intervening with personnel or equipment to the extent that they have in other conflicts.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Peter, just to, really continue to understand this, it's kind of like watching someone, a stranger on the street getting hurt, getting beat up and saying, look, I can't get involved. I don't want to get involved. That's to me what it's felt like and was explained to me from day one. But I've also talked to, a number of friends in the States and elsewhere. And they do have a belief that they don't want to get involved and they don't think they should get involved. At the end of the day, though, I think it's also important to think about, okay, well, what happens next? And that's my question to you. What happens next as it relates to, if in fact Putin's successful, hopefully he won't be, but maybe he will be. What happens there? And I also want to bring it back home to Canada, because you brought up a really interesting point in an article, I believe, that is saying that, look, we actually share an expansive border to the north with Russia.
That's right, Catherine. And your point about it being a divisive and very emotional debate for people, the expression "never again" is happening in real time. And these deeply disturbing images that we spoke of children, of people on the move, 4 million displaced people now, calls to Canada and other countries to step up the immigration process of proceeding quickly, cutting through some of the red tape to get Ukrainian people here. We have a 1.3 million Ukrainian Canadian diaspora in this country. So a huge connection between Canada and Ukraine. We were the first country to recognize their independence. We have quite robust relations. And so it is very much depending on your history and your view, an issue of whether Canada should and could do more, a responsibility to protect, which is something, an effort that Canada led at the United Nations some years ago that says if a country is under siege by its own government, we can do more. But this is a unique situation that probably falls outside that strict definition in the United Nations. But is there a moral obligation to do more becomes the question. And when we are seeing this type of wholesale slaughter of humanity, it is gut-wrenching to think that there is no ability to do more. So the sanctions need to be ratcheted further. I think there are innovative ways in which we can get more weaponry into the country, including fighter aircraft. We've done that in other instances. I think that at some point, looking outside perhaps NATO to countries like Australia, for example, who have military capability and who were also involved in Afghanistan, to intervene in ways that perhaps NATO couldn't because of this Article 5 and because of the threats and the rhetoric coming from the Kremlin. There are ways in which we can do more that surely are being discussed at NATO and top tables. Whether this conflict is going to rage on is very much up for debate. I think this could turn into a modern day equivalent of Vietnam for Russia. That is to say, they can take land inside of Ukrainian borders, but can they hold it? And it's going to be a street by street, city by city response from the people of Ukraine. They have been incredibly resistant, as you would expect, in trying to preserve their country from further Russian aggression. And so, I mean, we can only stand in awe of what they've been able to do. And as President Zelensky himself said, for those who suggested some time ago that Ukrainian forces were not up to the task of being NATO members, I think they've more than proven themselves capable of meeting that standard.
Yeah, absolutely. Describe a little bit, though, about how you see, just the idea of invasion and what Canada and Canadians need to think about it in terms of our borders. to the
Well, you
north?
referenced the Arctic. I've written on this going back to 2017, the fact that Russia share the Arctic Ocean with us. They've demonstrated aggression in the past, Catherine. They fly aircraft, old bombers, Tupelo and Bear bombers, up to and just to the edge of our airspace in the north. And we respond. We send fighter aircraft up to meet them, but we have, let's be frank, a clapped out fleet of CF-18s that are 45 years old. We need to revitalize the Arctic warning system, the Northern Warning System, which includes radar and maritime radar. And we need to make an investment, a significant investment in airfields and Arctic refueling stations. We need to have larger aircraft, or both aircraft and maritime ships in the Arctic. We're building the fleet, but not fast enough. Mm-hmm. The Russians on the other side of that ocean have done that. They've recapitalized old airfields and military facilities. And we, at this point in our time, in our history, are not up to that task. And so this is daunting for the Canadian Armed Forces and for our country to exercise sovereignty.
Peter, it's so interesting to, bring the conversation home to Canada and your comments about, the need for increased military spending. That's something that we don't talk a lot about in the news. You don't see headlines about it. I'm thinking and hoping that one of the outcomes with the Ukraine-Russia war is that and you're starting to hear more leaders talk about this, the importance of the energy file, energy security. That's a whole nother show we can talk about. But also the state of Canada and making sure that we are united. And I'd like to get your take in terms of the state of our federation right now.
Well, I think we are looking increasingly fragmented. I'm worried about the sentiment of the West. It's probably as bad or arguably worse than the separation movement that was going on in Quebec back in the 80s and before that. And they have legitimate grievances, let's be honest. The energy policies of the government, and I know this isn't a partisan show, but those energy policies have been very punishing and pernicious on the Western economy. The decision to shut down pipelines, that in and of itself has been one of the most divisive issues in my lifetime. We, the Conservative government, were proponents of the Energy East pipeline, the Trans Mountain, obviously Keystone. Those projects not proceeding have had a very detrimental impact on the Canadian economy, and quite frankly, well beyond our borders. Catherine, imagine for a moment if we were able to send liquefied natural gas to ports in Europe, replacing Russian gas, and so thus lessening the very negative impact that this is having on the global economy because of the overdependence on Russian gas, and look, pushing it even beyond this current conflict and moment in time is, of course, our overdependence on Saudi, at one time Iranian, Venezuelan oil and gas. This was never a good idea, let's be honest.
Well, let me stop you there for 1 second, Peter, because I think a lot of people still, they think that we're rich in oil. We've got so much oil. We don't need to pump anymore, et cetera, et cetera. And people don't even realize that we actually import oil from our East Coast, from Saudi Arabia. And people should also recognize that Saudi Arabia this week actually floated the idea of not having their oil priced in US dollars, but renminbi. Like, think about that. Just think about that. And why that's even there's no ESG in any of that.
Well, that's right. And that's the irony here, is that we in Canada have a very ethical, highly regulated oil and gas sector. If we were exporting to countries, just even a few in Europe and in India, and places that are over-reliant, quite frankly, not only on foreign oil and gas from countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia, but they're burning coal. If we were able to replace that with ethical Canadian, competitive oil and gas, we would be doing more to address greenhouse gases than anything that we could do in Canada. If we shut down our entire sector, we wouldn't have as much impact as replacing coal-fired generation in other countries. And let's be honest, that would also bring revenue to Canada, bolster our economy, our job market, and allow us to invest more in green energy and build our capacity perhaps to, ultimately get to Paris climate change commitments.
And the social side and how they treat women. I mean, that's the other irony here.
It's atrocious. Most of those countries didn't show up at all to the Glasgow discussion. And as you say, they have no interest in meeting ESG requirements.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. People need to know and listen and understand this more. And Sally, we're going to be out of time. I do want to get your take, just real brief here, on how you see the PC party evolving.
Well, this is continually a work in progress since the bringing together of the legacy parties. And the fault lines are still sometimes exposed when you see the pressures that are coming around certain issues, social issues in particular, but issues like oil and gas, legislation that is in place that's quite punishing to rural parts of the country, things like a carbon tax, gun registry programs. These are highly contentious issues, not just for Conservatives, but really for the country. But we have to come forward with thoughtful, costed solutions as Conservatives. We have to be able to resonate with those policies in larger urban centers like Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and other parts of the country. And we have to present ourselves as a party that's united and ready to govern. So more in line with Canadian thought and a pattern that is going to allow us to be competitive in the next election.
Absolutely. All right, Peter, we got to leave it there. Great to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Catherine. All the best.
Thank you.